Welcome. Good afternoon. I'm Deborah Krohn, Associate Professor and Chair of Academic Programs here at BGC, and on behalf of Susan Weber, Founder and Director of the Bard Graduate Center, it's my pleasure to welcome you to what promises to be a really fascinating exploration of dress, personal adornment, power, and other kinds of ornament connected to the body and the body politic over the next couple of days. The theme of the symposium reminds us of the ebb and flow of arts and power over time. So I'd like respectfully to acknowledge this place as Lenape-Hoking, the ancestral homeland of the Lenni Lenape, and recognize New York City as a past, current, and future home for many Indigenous people. Land acknowledgements honor customary Indigenous protocols for the thanking of hosts and call attention to ongoing realities of colonial dispossession. We also remember and honor the essential contributions of others who have traveled to these lands against their free will. At Bard Graduate Center, we studied the human past through its material traces. Founded by Dr. Susan Weber in 1993, Bard Graduate Center is an academic unit of Bard College. We're devoted to the study of decorative arts, design history, and material culture through research, granting of MA and PhD degrees, exhibitions, publications, and events, such as the symposium. We study objects from those created for obvious aesthetic value to the ordinary things that are part of everyday life, as will be borne out here. The geographic and cultural range of the papers that we're going to hear are a great illustration of the kinds of questions we like to think about at BGC. So welcoming both those of you who are here in the room with us and those of you in the larger world on the web. I'd like now to pass the baton to Ittai Weinryb, Associate Professor, who has organized the symposium and will introduce you to the order of the proceedings. Oh, and so instead of Ittai, who is the organizer of the symposium here at BGC, I'm going to introduce you instead to Elizabeth Williams, who is the co-organizer of the symposium. And there's some cue cards that I have in front of me. That's what's going on here. So much for communication. Anyway, it's great to welcome Elizabeth, who is at Dumbarton Oaks and will open the proceedings, followed by Ittai. Right? Okay, we got it. Okay, thank you very much. Sorry.
So can everyone hear me? Is that good? Great. Okay. All right. So rethinking the wearable begins for me in the storeroom, my primary place of encounter with the objects we will discuss in the next 2 days. At my home institution, Dumbarton Oaks, textile and object storage are separate rooms. And this is an arrangement that responds to the artifact's different climate needs. And this happens in many institutions, including at the Met, where we began our day in storage, thanks to Christine Brennan, Katrin Colburn, and Melanie Holcomb. In our storerooms, staff and visiting researchers wear surgical gloves to handle objects in brightly lit rooms resembling laboratories. Storerooms like these are a normalized condition of our scientific work. They're pristine environments following strategies that would maintain the fragments of the past forever. Today, storerooms are viewed as places of iconoclastic counter-narrative, contentious preservation, nonlinear exploration, and increasingly voracious energy consumption. But I want to reflect on the eerie disembodiment in museum storerooms and the implications of this disembodiment on the study of pre-modern wearables. Oh, sorry, something has gone there. Sorry. First, the physical separations of textiles and jewelry in storerooms like Dumbarton Oaks both reflect and reinforce the taxonomies differentiating medieval wearables according to medium or period. Scholarship, for instance, has long privileged questions of attribution, dating, and function, in an effort to fix wearables in place and time according to their production origins. This proclivity to catalog is at the heart of the medieval wearables' fundamentally museological framework, which emerges in part to make sense of objects whose contexts are today otherwise lost. A particular challenge when materials have been removed licitly or illicitly from archaeological settings or dispersed on the art market. Now, such taxonomic divisions extend also to the conditions of display in the public areas of museums. The stringent conditions necessary for preserving textiles require their temporary display in darkened rooms, for example, as we can see in this installation photograph from the 2019 exhibition, Ornament Fragments of Byzantine Fashion at Dumbarton Oaks. This generally means that fabrics must be physically apart from those medieval objects that could otherwise evoke holistic aesthetic, technical, visual, and material contexts. Considering medieval wearables in their own terms means instead overcoming taxonomic separations like these. Clothes, jewelry, and accessories were part of united systems on human bodies. Furthermore, wearables are highly transportable artifacts, and in their functions in the Middle Ages, they were ruled by a logic quite at odds with the fixed physical imprint of the storeroom or gallery setting today. Wearables take on different meanings when situated in fluid, cross-cultural, and period frameworks, which offer opportunities to consider how they participate both in culturally and temporally specific practices and in the universal human needs to adorn, cover, beautify, or protect. Take, for instance, this pair of enamel earrings found in Crete, dating to the 9th or 10th century. Their Arabic inscription reads on one earring, "Blessings from God," and on the other, for its owner, Zainab. Now, we might look for parallels of these objects in Greek and Latin inscribed jewelry from the ancient and late antique Mediterranean, seeing them as another example where labeling or names on jewelry is important. But we can also situate the desire to wear inscribed objects like these earrings within the tradition of taraz, or textiles inscribed in Arabic, a phenomenon that grew in popularity at first among early Islamic elite ruling circles, and later among a wide range of people around the Mediterranean and into Central Asia. Such a line of inquiry is made possible by looking at adornments and textiles as ensembles in a cross-cultural framework that considers at once the specificity of local practices and their participation in broader global trends. Second, the conditions of our storerooms limit how we today understand the ephemeral, particularly the sensory experience of medieval wearables. And I would say that this loss is even more dramatically evident in public-facing galleries, which necessarily privilege visual engagement over other kinds of ephemeral sensory experience. The storeroom's condition of eternal preservation, while crucial for safeguarding artifacts for the indefinite future, at the same time contradicts the wearable's intimate connections to ephemerality and the realities of the ever-changing human form. For similar reasons, studies of medieval wearables often diminish how these objects might reference or reflect attitudes towards deterioration, decay, and death. But wearables were then, as they are now, closely associated with life cycle events marking finite human time, such as birth, childhood, betrothal, marriage, and aging. That is to say, individual and family lifespans, pushing us to consider the wearable's time-bounded and at times ritualistic nature. For example, the 6th or 7th century gold marriage belt at Dumbarton Oaks depicts Christ blessing a couple in its central medallions, and its iconography suggests betrothal or marriage. The appearance of mythological figures in the surrounding smaller medallions encourages fascinating iconographic readings of this work. But we have precious little evidence external to the object suggesting how such a thing might have been used in marriage rituals, or how it functioned over the course of a couple's or an individual owner's lifetime. Recasting objects like this as part of life cycle events invites us to imagine how an artifact commemorated a single event fixed in time while also evoking family relationships over many generations as an heirloom object. Now, the conditions of the storeroom are furthermore oriented to saving preservable things, meaning that ephemeral practices not leaving evidence in the material record, like hairstyles, tattoos, cosmetics, or wearables too commonplace to have survived today, and much less be collected in a museum like Dumbarton Oaks, are almost impossible to recover, except in recourse to supporting technical or visual sources. For example, the 10th century literary book of manners, the brocaded book, Al-Kitab al-Muwashsha by al-Washa, evocatively describes the elites of Abbasid Baghdad, including the clothing, accessories, hairstyles, and personal adornments of both men and women, taking care to associate beautiful appearance with fine manners and upbringing. Al-Washa delights in describing the poetic verses inscribed on rings and garments, the perfumes used to scent clothing and adornments, the visual splendor of dress and furnishings alike. In spirit, his hyper-artificial text is close to the illustrations of this copy of al-Hariri's Maqamat, copied and illustrated by al-Siti in 13th century Baghdad. The manuscript is filled with depictions of people in voluminous robes, enjoying various entertainments and lushly decorated interiors. Such textual and visual evidence of ephemeral practices enlivens objects like this bronze earring excavated in Corinth, which still bears wool fibers. You can see that in the bottom half, perhaps intended to have been doused in scent. Thinking about texts, visual depictions, and objects together helps us understand how entire dress ensembles conveyed aspects of individual persona and prescribed cultural attitudes about human beauty. Third, the storeroom's organization, with its orderly rows of objects arranged in drawers, makes it difficult to appreciate the wearable's function in organizing the human form. The relationships of artifacts to one another, the stacking, matching, or mismatching of jewelry, for example, or the effects of layers of textiles and accessories, bring order to bodily chaos and emphasize symmetry, both visual and haptic. Wearables respond to the body's unruliness, reflecting efforts to evoke beauty, order, efficacy, and health. And in the process, they relate cosmic notions to human scale through somatic experience. Wearables can only be fully captured in the relationship to breathing, moving bodies, in the interrelationship of one part of the body to another, and in relating the adorned body to surrounding physical or architectural space. We might consider, for example, late antique tunics from Egypt, which cluster decorative and figural details in symmetrical and mirrored patterns at the shoulders, knees, and wrists. Decorative details at openings of the garment, such as the neck and the hands, would themselves have been further amplified with earrings, bracelets, necklaces, and rings. Furthermore, the shapes in the decorative areas of tunics, you can see these squares and these kind of L-shaped forms, also appear in furnishing textiles. And so there was arguably little visual distinction between the people and the furnishings and the walls. And that this seems strange to us today is really this reflection of this deeply ingrained modernist sensibility that would see us not looking like curtains. Yeah, I always think of the sound of music. Rather than considering these areas of material culture as discrete categories along the lines of medium or function, embracing the ambiguous boundary between body and object instead raises questions about taste for layering, the possible meanings of symmetry, and the relationship of the human form to its surroundings, among other interpretive possibilities. Now, lastly, while the storeroom gathers hundreds, sometimes thousands of wearables under one roof, these objects are viewed as individual units within the context of the history of collecting. Each artifact is given its own accession number, its logic determined by the often random acts of modern acquisition. Wearables are thus often cataloged discreetly without reference one to the other. And as a result, it's really challenging to appreciate the connections of single objects to communal or collective identities, although this, of course, was an important aspect of identity marking expressed through the wearable. By considering wearables instead as assemblages, we might begin to explore their potential political implications and the interrelationship of object and wearer, of wearer and group, and what pre-modern identity making might even have entailed in the first place. Especially challenging is the elusive exercise of understanding how individual wearers might have thought about their appearance and express themselves through their self-presentation. Now, we see hints of psychological engagement in a detail of a 6th century furnishing textile from Egypt, our cover image for the symposium. Here, a beautifully adorned Nereid or sea nymph regards herself in a mirror, scrutinizing her hair, earrings, and makeup. And it's a really remarkable image that draws on a very long iconographic tradition inherited from the ancient world. And at the same time, the image reminds us of human beings' timeless habit of judging one's own and others' appearances, and of the wearable's most fundamental acts, role in the most fundamental acts of making sense of ourselves and our place in the world. Now, these comments are meant to provide a general framework for the conceptual issues on our minds as we were planning rethinking the wearable in the Middle Ages, and they are viewed through the limitations of the storeroom experience. Yet it's also in the storeroom that some of my most imaginative thoughts about these works are generated in handling medieval wearables and relating them to my own body today. And as I'm delivering these introductory remarks, I realize how many of our symposium speakers, too, have had their own encounters with wearables in storerooms, sometimes even with me at Dumbarton Oaks, many of you actually, and how the curiosity engendered in touching and holding these objects has sparked the work that we'll hear in the next 2 days. And I really want to express the thanks to the speakers for their steadfastness over the past 2 years amidst the many professional and personal challenges of the pandemic. I'm going to turn the microphone over to Ittai to continue our thoughts about the wearable.
Thank you, everyone, and welcome to Rethinking the Wearable in the Middle Ages. I wrote all these things, but for the sake of time, I'll try and see if I can just talk things through. So when you do an event in medieval studies in New York City, you tend to send an email to all of your colleagues across town, telling them that in a year's time, there's going to be a conference on rethinking the wearable in the Middle Ages. And as much as you would like them to know, you also don't want them to schedule any other events on the same day. So I sent this email around. I think more than 100 people received that email. And I get a response from a very senior scholar in New York City who says, Ittai, this is a great topic, but why the word rethinking? We never really thought about the wearable in the Middle Ages. All of you in the room obviously laughing, thinking, all those people who don't know much about the wearable. But indeed, we did think all these years, we did think, no, just the remote. We did think about the wearable in the Middle Ages all these years. We did think about how people dressed from when we were children and looked at all these wonderful medieval dress books. We did think about how people behaved with one another, and we did think about the wearable. And so the question remains is, why do we need to rethink the wearable in the Middle Ages? Why the history that is so old by now, the history of fashion, the history of dress, the history of textiles, that there's many textile scholars with us and metalwork textiles with us today, was done for so long. So why do we actually need to rethink the wearable in the Middle Ages? Historians of jewelry also emphasize things like stylistic analysis and also the interaction between jewelry of various types and textiles. And again, all of this we already know. And so the question remains, why do we need to rethink the wearable in the Middle Ages? What we'll follow, hopefully in the next 5 minutes only, and not more than that, will be 10 points as to what happened, in my opinion and Betsy's opinion, in the past decade or even 20 years that calls us to rethink the wearable in the Middle Ages, rather than just say that we already thought about it or we don't know anything about it at all. The first, the past decade or so, the past 20 years, was very much dealing or centering on the notion of exchange, cross-cultural exchange, cross-geographical transmission of ideas and of objects became the lion's share, with fields in medieval material culture and art like Mediterranean art, Indian Ocean, Eurasian, growing and developing, centering just on change and exchange. And I'm very happy that today we have Cicely Hillsdale, whose dissertation on exchange between France and Constantinople was one of the foundation works on these issues of change and exchange. We did forget on the way, when we're talking about change and exchange, that in order to have an exchange, people actually had to meet. And so there was interaction between people wearing various dresses and forms of dresses, making us also rethink these ideas of how people interact wearing different forms of dress and forms of decoration. And on the top, I'm showing you the famous Marco Polo meeting the Khan, receiving the golden prizes. On the left-hand side, of course, the six kings in the fresco in Casa Amra, and of course the Sogdian fresco of the ambassador from various areas. So the idea of exchange always has to come with people meeting and people of different cultures with different forms of dress interacting. We can also think that not just ambassadors, but also other forms of exchange and meeting, whether it is the massacres of the Franciscans by the Mongols in the fresco, or merchants meeting, displaying various forms of dress. And of course, exchange is not just political, but also commercial. And I'm just showing you one of those objects, a belt hook that was most likely carrying a purse. And again, this idea of exchange as something that can be a leading way for us to think about or rethink the wearable in the Middle Ages. Developments in the field of history of science, and here I'm showing you the work of Ulinka Rublak, who deals with recreation of historical dress, calls us to rethink the idea of how people envisioned how people were dressed or how people were using wearable as part of our understanding, historical understanding of how dress meant for the maker and how dress meant for the wearer. Ulinka Rublak actually uses the term that we art historians know as period eye, the Baxendalian term of period eye, in order to envision this idea of historical recreation, not the classical historical recreation of dress that we know from the 70s, but actually the consciousness or the historical consciousness that actual recreating of historical dress gives you as a scholar and as an historian to understand the past and to understand the interaction with dress. In history of science, especially the rise of the field of alchemical work, which is something that, again, in the past 15 years, became more and more central. And here I'm showing you, of course, the workshop of the alchemist and the workshop of the goldsmith, both very well-known work, calls us again to this idea of how alchemy shapes and reshapes the way we dress and the way we think about the wearable, whether it's fake gems or gold turned from copper, and the way in which people historically envisioned or interacted with things that people wore. And just to show you, I didn't want to bring a boring recipe of alchemical jewelry, so just a modern day way of making diamond through science, or through, if you will, alchemy. Furthermore, the idea of the relations between body ornament and material ornament, between body ornament and craft, the relationship between making metal threads and filigree, the shared habitus, if you will, between the metal worker and the weaver or the dressmaker, all call to our attention that we have to really rethink or start rethinking the relationship between metalworking and dress, and the habitus of the maker in a broader sense of the word. In the field of comparative religion, many ritualistic practices such as pilgrimage, prayer, and even votive offering created in the past 20 years a very fertile ground to consider how humans behave in relations to one another and how humans behave in relations to themselves. In the field of the wearable, if you will, we have to start thinking about rituals of shaving and robing and unrobing in a comparative way in order to highlight rituals from the past, and maybe even highlight tacit or unknown manners in which people interacted in medieval times. Other rituals, and you all know the Razuk tattoo workshop in the old city in Jerusalem, shows forms of adornment that, as Betsy noted in her introduction, don't necessarily exist historically, but through forms of recreation and reconstructions and some remaining records from older time can actually give us an idea of how to rethink the wearable in the Middle Ages. Strangely enough, once going to archaeological digs in early 7th century BC and beyond, you can start finding bodies with tattoos. And you can find prints from the early modern period with records of tattoos. The Middle Ages forms a sense of lacuna, but then again, through reconstruction, we can think how to deal with these forms of, with this form of decoration or reform these forms of the wearable in the Middle Ages. Other forms of bodily mutilation that could also be considered as comparatively can also highlight forms of behavior and tradition of dress and redress and undress. And of course, since we are PG-13, I couldn't show you much more than that, but you remember the Berlin exhibition from the Jewish Museum on circumcision, both in Islam and Judaism, as a form of comparative study of the wearable, or the mutilated, if you will. Agency became very central part of investigation in art history and material culture in the past 20 years, whether it's the studies of Latour and Alfred Gell, material realities that speak of agency of things and the way things work, also call us to rethink the wearable in the Middle Ages. In that respect, the concept of apotropeia that was once, let's say, the lion's share of folklorists and anthropologists, is more and more becoming a key or a central way for us to think about wearable or art in general in the Middle Ages. And so thinking of apotropeia or bringing apotropeia to the table as part of rethinking the wearable in the Middle Ages becomes more and more central to our engagement. And here I'm showing you a piece of metal that was found in the Staffordshire hoard and was attached to a helmet of the warrior, and of course with the apotropaic inscription that helps the warrior in his combat. When thinking of the wearable, we should also think about the assemblage, which is another thing that maybe rethinking the wearable in the Middle Ages should bring us forward, rather than each object on its own. Textiles historians working with textile, jewelry textiles working with gems, and metal workers with metalwork. So the thinking of the assemblage as a form of interaction and interpretation brings us further to the idea of rethinking the wearable in the Middle Ages. Psychology, that is another field that develops in relations to object in recent years, and especially the concept of object and trauma that is becoming more and more central, helps us further to rethink the wearable in the Middle Ages. On the left, I'm showing you something relatively recent of a heart-shaped pin that was made in the ghetto and sent to a work camp. But on the right-hand side, you do see the Jewish wedding ring with the model, if you will, of the Holy Temple in Jerusalem that, of course, was not in existence. And so there is this idea of wearing something that is part of a traumatic experience that possesses memory and possesses recollection. History of disability, again, another field that develops greatly in the past 20 years, calls us again to recall or rethink the wearable in the Middle Ages. Middle Ages, not just made of very fit women and men, but also of the disabled, and how people solve these issues of disability through objects and through textiles. all of this makes us realize that it's high time for us to rethink the wearable in the Middle Ages with new avenues of research developing both in the fields of history, history of science, psychology, sociology, and anthropology. It is high time that for us to rethink the wearable in the Middle Ages. And as such, maybe this is the answer to that renowned medievalist who told us that we just have to think, or nobody worked on this topic at all. This topic or this project that Betsy and I are doing started in a session in 2016 in Kalamazoo. And we were very fortunate or unfortunate to be scheduled on a Friday evening at 7:30 p.m. Now, you know, as humans, that if there is a session that is scheduled for Friday evening at 7:30 p.m., if you are going to that session, it means that you don't have anything better to do on a Friday evening at 7:30 p.m. So there was a constant, if you will, valse of people entering and realizing that it's not very cool to be in the session and leaving. And so it was a very long and strange session. But it made us realize that there's a lot of work to be done, and there's a lot of things that we can do in order to rethink the wearable in the Middle Ages. So first and foremost, I want to thank Betsy, because we were partners in this since, I guess, 2015. And as you know, the pandemic was not very helpful in seeing this project through swiftly. Second, I would like to thank everyone at the Bard Graduate Center, Director and Founder Susan Weber, Peter Miller, the Dean, my friends, the faculty who are here with us today, Laura Minsky and Jen Ha, who did so much to make all of this happen, Josh, the student who is helping us today, Jocelyn, who is in charge of the beautiful poster and the graphics, James and his team of custodians who make all these tables appear and disappear miraculously, and Chandler Small and his security team for making us all feel very safe. A personal note, in March 13, 2020, I think the world shut down. This is a picture of I was in Washington. The National Gallery shut down, and this is the National Gallery on March 13, that Friday, when everything shut down and everything turned into such a mess for us in the past 2 years. And of course, pictures of flowers or cherry blossom in Washington, DC, that made us all go through this or survive through this. And this conference is very much part of the pandemic because it was rescheduled, I think, about 15 times. And we realized today that if we got all the speakers that were and could not and came and did not come in the past 3 years, we would have had basically 50 speakers today with us. And so I'm happy that it's finally happening. I'm very happy that we're finally stepping out of this thing that we had to live with in the past 2 years. And so I thank everyone in the room, especially because you are bold and brave to come and sit with us in the moment that the pandemic is over. And of course, thankful for everyone at home. There are more than 150 people right now listening to us. So you see that while the Corona is over, people are still enjoying the comfort of the Zoom. And so let us begin, because I think we're already running late, and that's a good sign of a good conference. We will have the papers. In the end of each session, there will be a Q&A. The speakers will come forward to sit and will answer questions. First, we will take questions from the room, but those of you at home who probably are looking at me, those of you at home can text or post questions in the Q&A function on the Zoom.